All right, so here we are, still in the Wayback Machine. We're kicking it with our friends in 2600 BCE, 2700 BCE, and we're sitting on the porch, and they're complaining to us that those stories, that those myths that provided the context for the lives of their ancestors and informed them about the world and why it is the way it is, and why they should live in it in a particular way. Those stories are no longer viable for them. They've lost faith in those stories. And so they're asking, it's like, what do we do now? We don't have a framework, a structure for living our lives. What do we do? And that's what I want to talk to you about here, is what a couple of them did. So the group I'm going to talk to you about here are called the Pre-Socratics. And that term is interesting because it tells you a couple of things. One is that these were folks that came before Socrates, our hero. And that is true for a lot of them. But interestingly, some of the folks that get labeled Pre-Socratics were actually contemporaries of Socrates. This term Pre-Socratics is an indicator of just how profound Socrates' thinking has been and continues to be in Western philosophy, that we literally mark an era by the beginning of his existence. And this is a guy that never wrote anything, right? We don't have any actual writings of Socrates, and yet he's seen as such a foundational, fundamental figure in Western philosophy that we mark up an era with his existence. All right, so these pre-Socratic friends of ours, they're looking out there and they're saying, well, if I no longer have these stories to help me figure out how to live my life, how do I figure this out? How do I find or create some sort of harmony, some sort of order without the stories to rely on? In other words, how do I figure out how the world works so that I can live in it successfully? How do I figure out what reality's like? And it's important to keep in mind that these folks had no Google. They didn't have telescopes or microscopes. They didn't have newspapers that plopped on their door. They didn't have YouTube. They largely had two things: their sense perceptions and their reasoning skills. So a lot of folks will sometimes say that these were kind of the world's first scientists, and that's not really true. They were more what I would call inquirers. They didn't want to rely just on gods and myths to help them figure out why the world is the way it is and how they should live in it. They used their senses and their reasoning to observe what they saw taking place, the phenomena in the world, and then they tried to make sense of it, tried to figure out why it was the way it was and what they should do in light of that conclusion. Now, most of the information that we have from the Pre-Socratics, or a lot of it, I should say, it comes to us in fragments, what are called fragments. So you can see a fragment here. It's from Empedocles. Little bits and pieces, sometimes just a part of a sentence, or sometimes maybe a whole sentence or a paragraph. And people have been studying for thousands of years the significance of this sentence or this piece of sentence. Now, for some of the Pre-Socratics, we have pretty good chunks of writing. So for Parmenides, for Pythagoras, we've got pretty good chunks of writing. And then we also have what are called testimonials, which are kind of weird. Testimonials are things that people wrote that they heard one of the Pre-Socratic philosophers saying, like, I heard Zeno say this, or I heard, who knows? I heard Thrasymachus say this, or it wouldn't have been Thrasymachus. I heard Parmenides say this, and then they would write that down, and then that gives us a little sort of key into what people were thinking as they lost their reliance on myths. All right, so Thales. Thales looks out at the world and he says, I don't know much, but I know that everything's changing. I see my kids, they're growing up and becoming different. I see my plants growing. I see bodies that die and then decay. Everything seems to be changing. In fact, I can't identify one thing that doesn't change. Even my wagon sitting outside, it doesn't change very fast, but I can recognize it's not the same condition it was 6 months ago. And so Thales recognized, gosh, the reality involves a lot of things changing. It doesn't seem like a big deal to us, I know. But to him, this was significant. It was significant because he drew the conclusion that in order for me to be able to observe things changing, there must be something that provides some amount of stability that doesn't change. In other words, for things to change, there has to be something that exists that doesn't change. It remains a constant, and therefore the world's not just chaotic, a chaotic mess of things constantly in flux. And so the conclusion that Thales comes to is underlying this reality of constant change must be something that unifies all of it, some essential kind of oneness that is at the core, or underneath is the wrong word, but that serves as the foundation for all the things that change. So he looks out at a cow eating grass and he says, somehow that cow eats the grass and it turns into milk. So there must be something that the grass and the milk have in common that allows the grass to change. What would that one thing be? That's the question. What's the substance that doesn't change that allows for all this change to occur? Can you think of what it is? Thales said it's water. He said the first principle and basic nature of all things is water. And again, we may kind of laugh at this, but it kind of makes sense if you're just looking at the world, right? Rivers turn into the ocean, and then they turn back into ice, and they may turn into steam, which becomes air. We could even look at what we now know about human anatomy and draw a conclusion that, yeah, you know what, we're kind of a lot of water. And this was the conclusion that Thales came to, is that water must be the building block of all the things in the world that exist and change. It changes without really changing. It just kind of changes form. And a lot of people have pointed out, it's like, that's a pretty similar insight that people came to when they started studying atoms. So Thales, got to give him props for coming to a not so ridiculous conclusion just by thinking about things. The key idea with Thales is that there must be some one thing that we can reduce everything in the world down to, and that was water. Now his buddy Anaximenes, and I'm sure I'm butchering that name, came to a similar kind of conclusion in the sense of there being just one sort of fundamental substance that allows for all of the change that we see in the world. But he said, no, dude, it's not water, it's air. And he kind of reasoned like this: if you make air really undense or less dense, you're going to get fire. If you condense the air, you're going to get cloud. If you really condense it down, you're going to get earth and rock. And so for Anaximenes, it was this idea that, yeah, it's this fundamental substance. You're right about that, Thales. You're just wrong about what the substance is. I think it's air. But for the two of these folks, the key insight here, or the key idea, was that they came to this conclusion that all of the different things that we see in the world, they're not really different in quality so much as they are different in quantity. In other words, we look out and we say, everything at its essence is water, and it just takes on different forms. Or everything in its essence is just air, and it takes on different forms. So the reality is kind of made up of one unifying thing that shapeshifts, that takes on different forms. Now, another philosopher or pre-Socratic thinker, Zeno. This one always makes students mad when I'm in class. Zeno comes to the conclusion that motion is a logical impossibility and therefore an illusion. And I'll show you why. Zeno says this. I'll turn my computer here so you can see my sliding glass door. Okay, so Zeno says this: you think you can walk over and you can touch that part of your sliding glass door, but that's not real. And then I say to Zeno, dude, look, I'm here. I'm rapping on the door. What do you mean I can't move over from my computer to the wall and touch it? And Zeno says, well, think about it. In order for you to go and touch that sliding glass door, you first have to walk half the distance. And I say, okay, that's true. I'll walk half the distance to the door. And then he says, now to get to the door, you have to walk half the next chunk of distance. So another, foot and a half. And Zeno will keep saying, and you have to keep doing that. You have to keep covering half the distance to the door. And then Zeno would ask us this: and when do you cross that last half? When does the distance between you and the door no longer have half of its distance? See what he's saying? And so Zeno says, I know you think you moved over to touch that door, but it's a logical impossibility. You never stop cutting you can never stop cutting the distance in half. There will always be an amount of space that brings you halfway to the door. Now, Parmenides came to a similar kind of conclusion, and through a very different method. the takeaway here is that Zeno is really challenging people and saying, you can't rely on your senses, Thales and Aximenes. You can't rely on your senses to observe phenomenon and draw conclusions about reality, what reality's like, because obviously your senses are not reliable, because you think I'm going and touching the door, but that's a logical impossibility. Zeno couldn't have said this, but he'd say, you think when you go to the movie theater that you're watching people on a screen that's actually moving, but it's really not happening. It's just a bunch of still images. So appearance is not reality, Zeno says. And you really have to rely on logic. You really have to rely on math, because your senses can deceive you. And we'll see this come up later in the semester when we start looking at the tension that exists between rationalism and empiricism. All right, so these are some of our first thinkers. There's more of them, but you can see they're trying to make sense of reality so that they can figure out how to live in it. And here's this little cartoon, presumably Zeno's spouse. She says, Zeno of Elea, how come you never take me out anymore? And Zeno says, why bother? Why bother? Movement is a logical impossibility. So there's your pre-Socratic humor for the day. All right, next up, Socrates.